Hello everyone, I'm Nancy Jose from the Department of English, and today we are going to take a look at another topic from the paper Popular Literature and Culture. And let's discuss the topic fairy tales. Almost all of us went to bed or grew up along with fairy tales, which started like once upon a time, and that story always brought us to a magical world. And so, a fairy tale is a short story that is set in a typical magical realm. And there will be human characters as well as otherworldly beings or creatures, including witches, wizards, etc. So, fairy tales are part of the folklore, and it is in the form of a short story. Many of today's tales have evolved from centuries old stories and that have appeared with variation in multiple cultures around the world. And it is difficult to trace out the timeline of fairy tales or when or about when it appeared for the first time. According to researchers, such stories may date back to thousands of years. And they have also found that the story of the Beauty and the Beast was written or it was there since thousands of years back. And fairy tales and works derived from them are still written today. And another thing is that the heroes of the story or of the fairy tale often faces unbelievable tests against evil villains. And fairy tales were written for aristocrats of the society and it represent royalty more. We can find prince and princesses in fairy tales, right? From that we can understand that fairy tales have that inclination towards aristocracy. And now about the characterization in that we can see in fairy tales. Characters and objects can have special powers, magical powers, and there will be magical objects or magical spells. And we can also find fairy godmothers and wicked witches, etc. These are also characters of fairy tales. And animals can also be found in fairy tales, and they act like people. So now about the setting of the fairy tales, the place where fairy tales are set as imaginary or of another world or even in another universe. So it is a totally imaginative world. And about the time, it is timeless or we can say that the time is also a fantasy in case of fairy tale and is often narrated in third person, and that is about the point of view. Now, let us take a deeper look at the characteristics of fairy tales, and they include mythical and worldly creatures, magical creatures, and fairy tales are rooted in magic and with mythical scenarios. That is why they are called fairy tales. That is the difference between fairy tales and folk tales because fairy tales contains those magical elements. And fairy tales were originally written for aristocratic audience, as I have mentioned earlier. That is why we can find the prince and princess and royalty more in fairy tales. And they have clearly defined good and evil characters. Here also we can find conflict between good and evil characters. And most often, fairy tales will have a happy ending, like they lived happily ever after. They end in such a manner in a happy tone. And sometimes the characters are strong, and often princesses in fairy tales are helpless and they can be freed with the help of fairies and other magical creatures. And the conflict is here, the conflicts often is between human and magic and can be resolved only by the help of magic, and that is why they are called fairy tales. And usually they have a happy ending as I've mentioned earlier, and they carry a lesson or a moral with them. They don't directly open up or talk about that message, but the readers or the listeners or the readers will get a lesson from the story, and they entertain the readers with magic and wonder, of course, like folk tales, fairy tales also entertain the readers with the magical elements and wonder. The fairy tales are based on a imaginative world, and they suspend our beliefs, and it helps us to escape from real life to another world. And the common examples that we know, the familiar examples are Cinderella, the story of Jack and the Giant Beanstalk, or the story of Rapunzel, and the story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So, as your home assignment, trace out the features of the fairy tales from any one of the fairy tale that you have read. And thank you so much for listening.